Welcome to the last session for the live stream audience, and also welcome to the last full session before the panel and where we have slides and maybe even some other things to share. So my session is titled Securing Your Azure Applications Like a Pro, or like a who's who of pros in Azure security. And I'm going to start with myself, as everybody else here today. So my name is Karl Ots. I work at a company called Azure. You surely have heard of it. I'm an Azure MVP, CISSP, and a Microsoft certified trainer. I run some user groups, conferences, and also part of the Global Azure Bootcamp this year as well on the global team. I've been working with Azure since 2011, so I've seen them portals that Martin showed me, and or showed all of us today. And I've been also working with securing different Azure environments. I tried to count how many of those, but around 100, maybe a couple. Triple digits is kind of a good enough gaze on a spectrum in there. And really the company sizes vary from small startups to huge Fortune 500 enterprises. But really the security concerns and security questions are typically the same. Maybe this kind of identity and access management stuff is a little bit bothersome for others, but the actual technical implementations are nevertheless the same here. And quick primer of what to expect in this session first. So I'm going to first talk about security in general, kind of introduce some of the terminology that I'm using here and I'm going to use. So don't worry if you are not a security jargon linguistic pro already. You will get some familiarity of the language during this session. Then we'll talk about Azure or Secure DevOps Kit for Azure. What actually is it, and why should you use it, and how to use it? And let's do a quick round of hands here. How many of you have actually used the Secure DevOps Kit for Azure before? You don't count. 3 people I didn't know before. So this is a good set for everybody. I just talked to Brady, wherever he is preparing for the panel. He hadn't heard of the tool either, and he supposedly works at the company who builds this product. So this is a good introduction for everybody who's working or interested or has to work with security on Azure. And then I'm going to wrap things up by listing a couple of topics and resources to help you get kind of started or ramp your security practices in even better levels, regardless of your current expertise of Azure security. There should be a decent amount of demos and ranting and whatnot. There's no kind of old man yelling at the cloud, but something in between. So let's get started with security. And first I'm going to introduce you the only absolutely secure computer on the planet. And it's this baby here. It's a beat computer, and I had to look it up, and this is called an abacus. So a beat computer is not connected to anything. There's no inputs. The state doesn't change or anything. So this is a place where you can actually say that this is absolutely a secure computer or computing or information system. But typically we have a little bit more complex system with said state changes or inputs or maybe even some processing of some of those inputs. Or maybe those computing systems even communicate with each other or talk to each other. And that means that we actually have to work a lot on our security. And that means also that we can't get absolute security, but we have some sort of prioritization or compromises that we need to make. And how to do that. And whenever there's talk of security, there's always talk of, today we had those three-letter acronyms. We had NSA. Now I'm going to introduce to you to CIA, not that CIA. So this has nothing to do with Central Intelligence Agency or the Chinese mafia. This is actually a security terminology or security paradigm of introducing confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the kind of never-ending struggle of which of these three to prioritize. So it's the same thing as if you're a consultant, or if you've seen this kind of old gags about you can get something that is expensive, you can get it something fast, or you can get something done in a very well manner. You can get two of those three, but not all of those. The same way typically here, we don't typically have the resources or timing available for us to actually get all of these three security properties in place. So confidentiality, of course, is something that helps us to protect against risks related to exposure of our information. Then we have integrity, which is about the trustworthiness of the data. Of course, there's risks related to who has last modified it. Is if the log entry says that this is the person who modified it, maybe if it's a business transaction, banking transaction, we need to be really sure that nobody else has made any changes on top of that. And then, of course, we have the availability, which deals of risks related to the denial of service or availability to this particular set of information that we typically want to protect. In the center of this CIA paradigm is typically data or information, which we kind of put some sort of security controls in place based on this prioritization. And what could these security controls then be? First of all, we have a ton of security controls that are related to authentication and authorization. We discussed this, or Saki discussed this in his session after the lunch. There's some controls that we can add that help us protect against some exposure, even though we will get some of those elevated privileges, and we will get to kind of bypass some of the application layer security levels. We can add something like encryption there, encryption in at rest or in transit. All of those help us to protect against the accidental exposure of data. Then we can add some monitoring to get better trustworthiness of data and protect availability by adding some backup resiliency or disaster recovery controls. And specifically in the olden days when we didn't talk about platform as a services, we discussed about infrastructure as services or containers or stuff like that. We needed to worry about something called host hardening as well. And this might look something like this. This is a screenshot of Azure Security Center. I have a couple of virtual machines over here. I've literally done nothing to them. I don't know what to do with them. I just know that Azure Security Center is telling me that there's Windows servers that I took out of the marketplace. There's some tasks or some configurations that I need to do. There's some markings or CC IDs in there that telling me that this is actually a known vulnerability or known security configuration that I could apply. Of course, if I would go and apply all of those, I would end up back to the Abacus type of scenario that I just couldn't do anything with my system. And that's why I need to do the prioritization, and that's why also with this pre-platform as a services side, when I actually do need to think about hardening this host as well, I actually had to do quite a lot before I actually can start talking about my application already. And Azure adds to that the complexity of platform as a services and something else that is not hosted on a host that we can control or patch or harden on our own. And that means that we can actually add some other security controls in there as well. So let's start with this one. All of our Azure applications are, regardless of which Azure services they are hosted in, they are actually sitting inside a subscription, or more specifically inside a subscription in a resource group. They have a globally unique address, so to say, this kind of scope that we can have there. Then we can have some controls that help us authenticate the user. It's always the user is always authenticated from an Azure Active Directory, whether a guest or a real user in that Azure AD. And then we can authorize that user to perform certain Azure Resource Manager actions through the role-based access control, what Magnus showed before. And then, of course, we can deploy these services through Azure Resource Manager templates. We can put in place some policies or logs that kind of overrule or complement these authorization patterns that we can add through role-based access control. And then we have logging, auditing, monitoring, encryption, backup and disaster recovery. Those are the things that were existing and are existing with the kind of previous slide that I had there that has to do with securing any types of applications. And then on Azure side, specifically the privacy compliance and the network security part, those are something that we more or less need to take granted. Martin was telling us previously that when they need to fill in some questionnaires from some of their auditors or potential customers, they need to answer some of those questions that they have no idea how Microsoft has implemented any of those. They just know that this works and this is the Azure service, or these are the ticks that I can put in some of those boxes in Azure, and that's it. This is something that it's more about documentation, finding out how does Microsoft implement it, or if it's a big enough priority for us, if Microsoft does it wrong for our purposes, then this is a deal breaker and we can't use these services for our application's purposes. So there's tons of new controls that we can add from Azure point of view, but really the reality in Azure is that even the basics that we used to have already in the kind of host hardening ways, even these basics are really lacking in standard environments. Here is an example of an enterprise customer with, as you'll see, 200 resources in Azure. So there's 200 resources in Azure. You'll see there's some servers, then blank names. Essentially, there's some virtual machines. As you'll see, there's 70 storage accounts. There's app service, there's SQL database, virtual machines, stuff like that. And actually, if we start to look at what are the top failing scan results, or top failing security controls, we start to see the familiar pattern of those very basic stuff. Missing updates, auditing not enabled on a SQL database level, only on the server level, app service allowing HTTP connection, very basic stuff. Sometimes even a tick in the box exercise in Azure world, even maybe in a traditional world as well. But this is really just saying that, okay, we know we had to do this on the security side, but let's just figure about this later when we hit production, or when the first leakage happens, or when the first customer asks. And it could be really tedious to start fixing those at that later stage, specifically when with Azure services, it's not as easy as, yes, let's put in the process of somebody actually going and making sure that the updates are installed. It could be something that affects our whole architecture. All right. And how can we then kind of manage that complexity of those added security measures that we could have, but we don't maybe even have an idea of how are we doing at the moment, and how could we fix those in Azure? Enter Secure DevOps Kit for Azure, or AzSK.
You were highlighting those vulnerabilities. How did you discover them? Do you have a scan across this resources?
This one? Yeah. So this set of scans is based on this Secure DevOps Kit for Azure, which I'm going to talk to you about right now. And this is a set of tools essentially for assessing or scanning for vulnerabilities on your Azure environment. In the previous case, there were 200 resources with four different resource providers. We had SQL database, app service, storage account, and virtual machine. That's it, nothing else. even with that, we had a ton of different vulnerabilities, ton of different results that we needed to follow up on. And really, that's kind of a start on this kind of cloud security is really, really hard, and we really need to know what we are doing and how we really need to have the idea of how are we doing at the moment. So that's why Microsoft built something called Secure DevOps Kit for Azure, or AzSK. And it is a set of tools for running these scans against your Azure environment, automating the scanning, and even integrating with your CI/CD. It's not, it doesn't replace, or it's not a kind of competitor to Azure Security Center. It's actually using Azure Security Center for the virtual machine parts of work. So previously, my first screenshot was from Azure Security Center telling me about the needed security configurations, the host hardening. There's another view of Azure Security Center based on the same set of data that's telling me that which virtual machines are missing updates. That's good, but what about all of the other parts of Azure? What about the platform as a services parts? And that's why Microsoft IT, or Microsoft Core Services Engineering, actually built this Azure Secure DevOps Kit for Azure, or AzSK. So it's not a Microsoft Azure product group product, nothing like that. It's not part of Azure Security. It's actually just an open source piece of tooling that Microsoft themselves are using to secure and follow the security posture of their existing Azure applications. They don't tell us how many Azure applications they have, but since last Microsoft Ignite, they've been telling us that, okay, Microsoft has at least 1,000 subscriptions on running their own internal applications in Azure, or at least 1,000 applications of those are actually covered under this AzSK. So they are building the screenshot or dashboard similar to what I had there to kind of see the overview of what is their security doing at the moment, or what are the application teams doing at the moment regarding security. It's quite easy to get started. The first scan that you can run is so-called non-intrusive, which means that you can run it with reader access, role-based access control, reader scope or reader role assignment in a subscription scope, and with any type of Azure AD user. And you can expand this later on to run this continuously to instead of just showing the results in your terminal or in your PowerShell output window, you can actually store your output in your Azure logs and query those using custom query language. You can have Power BI to kind of visualize that, whatever you want to do. You can even integrate with your CI/CD. And specifically, today we are going to talk about the scanning part. This is scanning for vulnerabilities, which is exposed to us in two different ways. First is the subscription health scan, which is more or less the stuff about the governance, the stuff about identity and access management that we've been hearing today before. So it's a good kind of overview of what are the best practices in there, and a good way of knowing how am I doing right now at the moment. As you noticed, the UI changes anyway all the time. So making sure that are my users coming from an external Azure AD or my own Azure AD or wherever they are coming from can be quite tricky unless you use some tooling or unless you have very few resources to actually check manually. And then we have something called subscription or service verification test scans, which actually go into a lot more detail per Azure service level. Then we have secure intelligence. So if you are building new solution, if you're using the full-blown Visual Studio IDE, you can actually install a secure intelligence plugin, and you'll get those nice red squiggly lines on top of your unsecure code. So they're warning you about unsecure crypto implementation in .NET. They are warning you about if you're using storage SDK in a way that you are creating too wide privileges or too, you're creating public access or too long SAS tokens, that kind of stuff. So if you're using the full Visual Studio, I really recommend you to install the Secure Intelligence plugin from the gallery. Then there is a Resource Manager template checker. So this is actually something that you can't install yourself without AzSK, but it is actually running locally. So this is actually just when you install AzSK on your environment, you can actually then use the local ARM template checker to verify whether or not your Azure Resource Manager templates are built in a secure manner. So this is actually done before your ARM templates are sent to the actual Azure Resource Manager deployment server, and when they are actually validated against your proper resource group. So your flow of verifying your Azure Resource Manager templates is first verify if it's actual JSON, does it run at all? Then let's verify is it actually compliant with those APIs? Then verify if it's secured using the ARM template checker, and then see if this stuff actually gets provisioned in with your access credentials with that specific resource group that you are targeting the deployment in. And after that, it can fail or go through. And both these scans and the ARM template checker can be integrated with your Azure DevOps, formerly known as Visual Studio Team Services, with those full plugins, one for ARM template checker and one for the security verification test scans. Very quick overview of the subscription health scans. There's a bunch of stuff about authentication and authorization. I'm not going to just read through a bunch of lines for you. We've discussed in very lengthy details today about authentication and authorization in Azure. The main things I want to point out here are please make sure that you are only trusting the users from within your parent or original Azure AD. If they are coming from somewhere else, you have no idea of knowing who is managing them. You have no idea of how can I actually trust that this is actually coming from this partner or customer Azure AD? How can I know that they are actually who they claim to be? And the other one here will be about the privileged identity management that Magnus also mentioned. Essentially, you shouldn't really grant permanent access in a subscription level scope, and specifically with this owner or contributor level access. You should always grant minimal access and then elevate your privileges using the privileged identity management whenever possible. Price could be an issue, but whenever possible. Then quickly relate to governance. What does this scan actually check from your environment? It checks that whether or not are you using resource logs and whether or not you are using those policies that we discussed today as well. Yes? Yes, so in this particular case, it actually checks against any, this particular unit test of security actually goes ahead and checks, enumerates all of those accounts that are granted on any scope in your target subscription that you're scanning that are guest accounts in that AD. And that might or might not work for you in your particular case. In Microsoft case, their identity provision and governance is that everybody gets provisioned an account in their AD. This is not a universal product as such. We can customize it for our own purposes, but what this check or this test actually runs is that if there's any externals, then you get a flag called failed. Yes, very good thing to point out. This is not my list of best practice. This is the Azure Secure DevOps Kit for Azure's, so Microsoft IT's list of best practices related to security, which we can go ahead and customize this result if we want to. Yes. That's a very good very good question. Why will Microsoft use more than 1,000 subscriptions of their own? I would think that they are old enough in their Azure utilizations that they might have the same problems that everybody else in the early adoption, that they have more agreements than one. That could be a very good reason. If you will start now, both my and Microsoft's best practice is that try to minimize the amount of subscriptions as much as possible. But of course, they are a huge organization, obviously one of the biggest in the whole world. They have some scenarios where it makes sense to have more, but obviously that's way too much for any amount of applications that they have in there.
What is the best practice? How many subscriptions?
The best practice is to minimize them, period. And after that, it depends, and I'm a free consultant, so let's talk later. But there are some technical limitations of having, essentially, when you start to have more than 50 subscriptions under one account, you start to see some performance degradation in your Azure Resource Manager and different portals in there. Great question. All right, then the scan actually goes ahead and checks whether or not you have resolved all of the Security Center alerts, makes you to write down the reason why any of those users who have owner access permanently have them, and also makes you document and then clarify why do you have any of those public IP addresses, public IP address resources defined in Azure. And that about it. On the Azure ARM side, it essentially goes ahead and checks, are you using classic resources? And if you are, then you're a bad person and you get a red flag in your scan report. All right, so we had two types of scans. We had the subscription health scan, and then we have the security verification test scan, which actually goes a lot more deeper than this generic subscription health scan. There's a bunch of different Azure tools or Azure services that are already covered. They are adding more and more all the time. But if you think about it this way, this is built by Microsoft IT. Microsoft IT is essentially scanning all of their applications using AzSK, meaning that this should be pretty much the list that these are all of the Azure services that Microsoft IT is running on production, right? So whenever they start to have new applications, they add some new applications in this SVT coverage as well. Some late additions, there's AKS in there, there is Key Vault, there's Logic Apps finally, and some other great stuff there as well. Let's do a quick review of how concrete that will actually be. When we run this security verification test in our resource group or a subscription, it takes a lot more time. It's a lot more detailed set of questions, but essentially, for example, if I would run this against my subscription or resource group that would have a key vault, it will actually test for these different types of security controls and whether or not I have put those in place or not. Don't share key vaults across applications unless you really trust them. Don't cross that trust boundary in there. That's mainly because Azure Key Vault's access management is really crappy. You actually can only grant access. First of all, you grant access on the resource role-based access control level, and then on top of that, you grant access inside the key vault. So I could get reader access to the key vaults for its secrets or its certificates. And if I have that, I can read all the certificates and secrets in that key vault. So if I'm an application that's competing with another application in there, of course, I don't want those users to see those secrets or those certificates, right? Service principal, or this is also a kind of more generic one as well. Actually, this is from your point of view. Technically, it's usually a service principal or a managed service identity, but it could be just that you are reading this from an ARM template, for example, and you had two different sets of ARM templates that are deployed to two different deployments, but are actually sharing the key. there is a test for that. It doesn't go very deep. I think there's not much automation on that. It just essentially flags for you that this is something that you should check. This is how you can check these things. Then it checks, well, this is very automatic one, so it actually goes ahead and checks whether or not you're actually storing the access logs and diagnostic logs to a log analytics workspace, how long is the retention, and also are you retaining your key vault keys or secrets, and how does it actually check that? Is actually it checks whether or not you have an expiration date on all of your secrets in there. If you don't, you get a flag that's saying that you're doing something bad. All right, how can I try and install this thing? Essentially, it's one PowerShell module that you install from PowerShell gallery, install -module AzSK, and then that's it. And obviously, it does require the Azure Resource Manager modules, so don't try to use this in conjunction with the AZ type of PowerShell. All right, and with that, let's jump into the demo. It worked on the first try. Interesting. So I have here a pretty standard set of applications. There is a storage account, an app service plan, and an app service. Nothing really super specific here. It's sitting in my specific subscription over here in this resource group that we have over here. And yes, so I've logged into the same subscription underneath the same Azure AD tenant. So I'm actually authenticated against that specific tenant, whether or not I am using a user from that tenant. And because I've logged in, I should be able to run this command get-AzSK subscription security status. And this is now the subscription health scan that I was telling you about previously. This is pretty fast, pretty straightforward. There's a 20 or so different tests that it runs, as I mentioned. And we are actually quite fast in our results. And what do we actually have in here as a result? We have a CSV file, and we have a folder, and inside that we actually have just one log file called subscription core. And we are going to drill a little bit deeper what's happening in those CSV and those other files. But meanwhile, I'm actually running the other line, get-AzSK Azure Services Security Status, which is now the security verification test scan. This will take a little bit longer time, but essentially it's running against the same subscription with that specific resource group that I just showed you. So there should be only an app service plan, and a storage account. And I'll just run this thing. It's going to take a little bit more time. So let's just put this on the background and let's see what's actually inside of these logs. All right. So this is the subscription health scan that I talked about in more detail just previously. Very quickly, how does this log file look like? This is the CSV file. I have a status, passed, failed, check manually, verify, and so forth. And then I have a severity. So is it a high alert? Is it a high severity, critical, or medium? Most of them are medium. I think there's like only very few amount of low level of tests that are labeled as low. And very quickly, let's see. I shouldn't have old types of accounts. I shouldn't have any of those external accounts. And let's see. Actually, this is high, and actually, this is actually failed. So do not grant permissions to external accounts outside of the native directory. And if I want to drill a little bit deeper of why is this bad or which users are those outside users. And I can actually navigate a little bit more this. I love Excel. So there's this run command, remove dash Azure RM role assignment, the sign-in name, etc. So they give us some tooling, not super helpful, but some tooling to actually see this, see through this. Then there's the actual specific subscription, the log file name, and so forth. And actually, if we dig through that log file, we'll actually see that one of those tests that this is the one that is failing right now here. It's actually telling us that this is actually a failing test because we found that this user that's actually signing in as a external in this Karl at onmicrosoft.com Azure Active Directory. So this is quite actionable. I can dig a lot deeper here if there were too many owners, if there were users using co-administrators or stuff like that. I will see all of those listed in this more detailed log file that is produced after each run of these security AZ security scans. And we'll actually see that if we see, we'll actually see that the security verification test actually has run as well. It took a little bit more time, and there's a little bit more tests that were run. And actually, on top of the CSV file, we now have a folder with the name of the resource group, and then actually 2 log files, one for app service and one for the storage account as well. You will find similar details for both of them in the form of the log file. And actually, for the CSV file, it's going to look like something like this. We have a couple of more here. We have some, again, similar format, severity, status. As an auditor, I just go in and see everything that's failed, and then there's work for us until eternity. But when you're actually thinking about this holistically from covering all of your bases in your application, of course, then you go through all of those manuals and hopefully also have a tap on the back for the past ones there as well. There's stuff, as you saw, storage accounts must be rotated. There's stuff like, please, don't publish from Visual Studio using publishing profile to your app service and stuff like that. All right. So, yes. Yes.
You said that it requires Azure Resource Manager for PowerShell.
Yeah. So the question was what about using the new PowerShell AZ format, which is upcoming and is you're not allowed to, or you can't install the regular Azure PowerShell and the AZ PowerShell on the same machine. And the answer is tough luck. Sorry, not supported yet. And hopefully, we don't really know what's going to happen with the AZ type of Azure PowerShell yet. So when that becomes more dominant, of course, we hope to see that supported. I personally use actually the AZ CLI, so the cross-platform CLI, a lot more than I use the Azure PowerShell tools. But this is a place where I actually find this so valuable that I want to use these PowerShell modules in here. Karl? Not AZ PowerShell. It's not supported. Not on AZ. This is available only on the Azure RM module, so the traditional Azure PowerShell, and end of support. You're welcome. All right, so that was just one scan. my application might have more than one resource group. I could have more than one subscription, and maybe I want to run this scan more than just once in a kind of an exploratory nature. So this is an example of a dashboard or visualization of what can you work with if you periodically run these scans and store this data in your log analytics or Azure Logs store Azure Logs, and query this using custom query language. Very similar stuff. There's some dates that I can filter with. There's some run identifiers, specific past failed. What is the criticality status? What is the control ID? So more details. Everything that we had in the CSV file just dumped into the Azure Log format, and this is a place where we can start building this kind of dashboards of green and light and these pie charts that I had on one of my previous slides that showcase the overall security posture of a application or an enterprise. All right. Very briefly, I mentioned that there are some plugins for Azure DevOps available. There is the Azure Resource Manager Template Checker plugin that I do recommend to run prior you actually start to deploy or try to deploy your Azure Resource Manager templates through Azure DevOps. Of course, then in this case, I just have a template deployment after that when the validation has passed. And then there's also the security verification test, which is exactly the same SVT scan that I ran that we just looked at on the CSV or the log analytics side. This is just integrated here in my particular pipeline here. So that whenever I run this release, try to release an application into Azure, I can actually decline or I can actually fail this overall deployment if I get more security verification test fails than I had previously, or if there's any. I could be very prudent about my security that there can be no failed scans or no failed results in this any of these environments. Well, I think the biggest benefit there will be the amount of time before you actually run the ARM template deployment, which is done on the Azure server side. If you already can kind of statically analyze from your ARM templates that this is a wrong configuration, you win build minutes with this type of approach. Yes. So the ARM template, to kind of reiterate for this recording and stream, so the ARM template checker does only so much that you can't define everything in ARM templates in all Azure resource providers. So it does check for some configurations on the desired state, but the security verification tests actually go a little bit more deeper for those that are kind of these manual ones that we discussed before. How can a template or how can a checker know that whether or not these are part of the same application or anything like that? And the SVT also checks for the actual status, not just what does the template say. All right, and typically, as with those examples that I had before, typically these are the most commonly failing Azure Secure DevOps Kit for Azure tests. A lot of stuff has to do with authentication and authorization. Again, people having everybody is an owner in the subscription level, maybe using their own Gmail identities or live identities. This is something that we have been talking a lot. So then the next level will be that, okay, no users are owners or no users are granted access on the subscription scope, but okay, now service principals are granted to wide privileges. Or sure, my actual Azure Resource Manager deployments are done in a very prudent manner, in a very detailed or limited set of privileges, or limited scope in wider privileges. But when I actually open connection strings or create access to any of my storage or messaging solutions, I start to have some kind of read, write, and manage all type of SAS token approaches. The other big one is always monitoring. Typically, the first reason I get if I ask why don't you have monitoring in place on any of these solutions is that you either need to pay for it, it's another extra step to take care of, or I need to have some governance in place. Do I store those Key Vault access logs in the same subscription or in a third party or third place where I don't have access to? Do I store them in a storage account or a log analytics? Oh, I don't know. For the security center or these kind of advanced threat protection alerts, there's some cost involved, not much, but there's usually an email that they want to send. Whose email do we put in there? In there, let's not just put anything in there and let's skip it. That's very typical response there. So there's a bunch of stuff that Azure Network Security side on the web application firewall can store a bunch of different very detailed logs for us on the application layer. The Azure SQL can store or generate a ton of different activity events and even this kind of machine learning alerts for us. And those should most definitely be taken into use. And then the last one, the big one, is the use of those storage accounts that are defined in a public access level or don't require any authentication at all, for example. All right, let's start to wrap things up on this side. So let's see how to get started with this AzSK. So again, if you have the tooling in place, if you have PowerShell with Azure RM modules installed, or like me for this demo, you can just spin up a VM on Azure. It's a single line of PowerShell to install, and it's a single line of PowerShell to run the subscription health scan or the security verification tests. You get a CSV file, and you get more detailed log files. It's a very great way to kind of see what is your current status and what will be the things that Microsoft recommends for their own services. You'll be busy for a while after the first one. And yes, so when you actually run these in a more periodic basis, maybe as part of your CI/CD or just regularly against your log environment, you can start to set up this continuous assurance practices in there. Awareness is a big part of this. So if you start to see, as on my dashboard example, we started to see that there's a couple of failing controls, missing updates, or no auditing on DB level. If you have this type of stuff happening often, and if you are not the actual developer building these solutions, then please educate your teams that, okay, this is something that we see a lot happening. Maybe do you want help with that? And when you start building new stuff, yes, first check them with the ARM template verifier. There's also a library of secured Azure Resource Manager templates available from the same AzSK resource that I'm going to share to you later as well, so you don't have to build everything from scratch if you don't really want to. All right, and really, as already pointed out by a couple of the questions here, this is not really any sort of a silver bullet for ticking the security thingy and then we're done with security. Now we can add more features. No, AzSK covers very specific set of quote-unquote administrative access stuff. So if I have some credentials that are not stored in Azure AD, or if they are not part of the Azure native approach, then those are not covered. If you have publicly available unauthenticated users accessing your stuff, then I don't know what you're doing there. So the application level access still requires some threat modeling for you to actually do and see how are you crossing those trust boundaries between your app and your Azure administration side. And really, this is just the Microsoft IT's own view of security. There are things that don't make sense to all, or there are things that don't make sense to anybody. So some of those recommendations that they have in there are stuff like, yes, you should always use the more expensive storage account, which has more. It's more expensive, but it has more redundancy because it's replicated across several more data centers. Does it make sense to use that? For Microsoft, maybe yes. For anybody else, not in all cases. So again, let's go back to the CIA approach of seeing what are our priorities. If availability is a big thing and our application actually supports it more, then sure, let's add that. All right, my slides will be available at Jurli/Karl-slides. Oh my God, that was a bad thing to add there. And the Secure DevOps Kit for Azure is available at azsk.azurewebsites.net. If you want to have more detailed demos or quicker version of this talk, you can check my talk from last Microsoft Ignite. If you want to learn more about how to secure or how to do threat modeling at all, there's Microsoft Stride is a good model there. You can check out the Stride threat modeling lessons from Star Wars. Very good analogies there. And there's great resources from the Azure Virtual Data Center and the Azure Security and Compliance Blueprint, which is not the Azure Blueprint that Magnus was talking about. It's a set of let's say best practices approaches to different types of applications related to data warehousing, related to web applications, from the point of view of specific compliance to PCI DSS or some of those other compliance requirements. With that, I thank you on my side, and I think I'm going to switch my hat next to an organizer slide, but before that, any questions? Yes? Yeah. So question about subscriptions and how many subscriptions should my application have, or how many subscriptions should my whole enterprise have? Quick answer again, it depends, and obviously it depends. But whenever you are crossing the subscription boundary, even though it's sort of a soft or virtual boundary, you actually cross a trust boundary within Azure, even though you are still authenticated as the same or from the same identity provider. Even though if it's still the same Azure AD tenant that's granting the access and verifying that this is the user, the actual calls and actual authorization is done. Again, it's another role-based access control assignment, so it's another trust boundary that you need to verify. Those need to match. And also in some cases, that means that we incur more costs. If you want to cross those boundaries, if you want to network those together, you might incur a lot more costs because you are actually going outside of your Azure subscription. So from the Microsoft or from Azure's point of view, Azure resource provider's point of view, you're actually coming as an external customer back again. If you don't want to combine them together, you don't necessarily want to do that, but if you want to do that, then keep those things in mind. If you only ever plan to have those 3 subscriptions and you're a software as a services company doing only that, and then go have 3 subscriptions, one for dev, test, and one for prod, go nuts, and one for your maybe IT stuff or whatnot. If that's just one of your many applications from your consultancy gigs or from as an enterprise customer, then definitely look for some commonalities across those, and how will they then work together and communicate to each other across the life cycle of the whole of your Azure usage. But the default answer will be to have all of those in one subscription and separate there using resource groups, and also prudent access or authorization management in there. All right, with that, thank you from the presenter Karl's side, and then we had some announcements.
Yeah.
Yeah.